watching the Mystical Green Beanie.
Hey, what's going on, dudes and dudettes? I am the Mystical Green Beanie, and I'm in a Batman mood right now, so I'm going to talk to you guys about Batman. Now, I've made several videos in the past couple years talking about Tom King's Batman run, and how I think that's one of the best runs on the character since Grant Morrison, and now that Tom King's run is finally over, I wanted to give you guys my thoughts on Scott Snyder's Batman run. And I've been wanting to do this for a while, mainly because I feel like in a lot of my Batman videos, I sound like I'm shitting on Scott Snyder, and I mean, that's because a lot of the times I am, but I don't want you guys to think that I hate Scott Snyder or that I hate his run on Batman. In fact, I think that for the most part, the Snyder Capullo run is quite wonderful. And then there's the rest of it. But all jokes aside, because that was a joke, I am very conflicted on this run, and it's going to be really fun to tackle this series all the way from Court of the Owls to Last Night on Earth, with the exception of Batman Eternal, because I'm not reading all of that. I mean, I like when comics are long and have massive story arcs, but when it's too long and too massive, it's just not fun anymore. So, as I've mentioned in videos before, I am in the minority of people who don't think that this run is the end-all be-all, and I don't think that Scott Snyder and Greg Capullo are two halves of the second coming of Christ. No doubt that I think they're really good, but they just don't really get my hype engine going all that much. I mean, as people, hell yeah, but in regards to the run on Batman, not so much. But first things first, one of the biggest praises that I can give this run is that it's incredibly accessible. Like, anyone can pick it up, read it, and not get lost. Because there's very little context required for reading this run. If anything, all you'll really need to know going into this is what everyone who knows a little something about Batman already knows. Dead parents, a bunch of Robins, and his rogues gallery. Joker, Riddler, Penguin, Aaron Eckhart from The Dark Knight. Hell, I'd say that if you've watched at least 2 to 3 episodes of Batman the Animated Series, then you're solid. It's very casual reader friendly, and I think, especially in today's current comic book climate, and with a character that's been around for 80 plus years, that's a good thing. However, I will say that one of my biggest negatives with this run is that it's as accessible as it is. Because if you're new to comics, this run is going to blow your mind with how crazy and out there all of the things that Scott Snyder is doing with Batman. And to be fair, I'll give it to the man. It had been a long time since we had a horror-centric Batman, and he provided that. He also had a really solid voice for Bruce Wayne that I think really struck a chord with people, including myself. He has this take on Bruce Wayne where this is very clearly an established Batman who has experienced 80 plus years worth of continuity and buys into his own hype a little bit. And even that serves as a character arc for Bruce throughout this whole run, where in the beginning he sees himself as this larger than life state of mind because he is Batman before he's Bruce Wayne. But as the run continues, he starts to accept his mortality a little bit more, which I think is a really interesting take. And it's very postmodern, and in some ways, it's kind of like a fusion between gutter punk and metal, if that makes any sense. Like, if Grant Morrison is psychedelic pseudo-James Bond Batman, and Tom King is introspective Nolan 2.0 Batman, Scott Snyder is rock and roll Batman. Especially with all the fuck the establishment type stories that Snyder and Capullo tell with this version of Batman, and how Bruce is fighting various Illuminati style villains, and even questioning how, with Batman being as big as he is that a good thing? Being larger than life and above everything else and everyone else? But I do take some issue with it, because it's not a completely original take. Which isn't an inherently negative thing, seeing as how comics are an ongoing medium, and how there's bound to be repetition here and there, but it's especially glaring if you were reading Batman comics at the time, and was current in the content that was coming out, namely Grant Morrison's Batman run, and his sister series Batman Incorporated. And I'm gonna try not to, but there's gonna be some Grant Morrison comparisons here. And I think that's somewhat unavoidable. But the best way to enjoy this series is in a vacuum, because it's a really good standalone piece, but looking at it within the scope of the larger history of Batman, even just the more recent material, or what was considered recent at the time, it's kind of frustrating to read through. Oh, and I'm probably going to break this review up into 2 videos, because I really don't feel like editing a 40-minute video, because I do have a lot to say on this run. And with that said, without further ado, let's get into the review. So I'm going to talk about this run in arcs as though it were a manga series, because honestly, that's kind of how it's paced. And that's something that I really admire about this run, because while this does mean that the series as a whole is paced for the trade, Snyder also remembers that he's writing an American comic book and will write issues that have a definitive beginning, middle, and end, and provides a really satisfying read. In fact, I'm going to say this up front, this run is paced way better than Tom King's Batman run. Especially when you get to the latter half of King's run, like everything after issue 50 is just kind of not paced all that well. And I also think that this is paced better than Morrison. And that's mainly because, unlike Morrison, Snyder tells the bulk of his story in one book, which is a huge plus for me. Now, the first arc I want to talk about is Court of the Owls, or I guess it's 2 arcs, even though it's clearly just one story that he and Capullo are telling, but I'll get into that in a minute. This arc is hailed as one of the greatest Batman stories ever told, and I don't get it. And by that I mean I do. So first off, just looking at the visual style that Capullo lends to the book, we're told exactly what this run is going to be and what the tone is. There's this inherent creepiness to Capullo's art style that feels very gothic and feels very haunting, but it's also super stylized and surprisingly upbeat. The best way that I can describe this run visually is that it looks like album art for a metal band. This feels very metal, specifically industrial metal. Like, you can read this and play Tyrant of Death, or Mick Gordon, or UDO in the background, and it not feel out of place. And I think that works perfectly for a postmodern Batman, because it's so unique and such a fresh take on the character, which is also really fitting since the previous Batman run is all about Batman having different eras of his life, and each being somewhat different from the last, and how that's a good thing. Capullo also makes some character designs that are pretty obvious for the time, that I'm grateful that he steers away from in subsequent issues, chief among them being his design for the Joker, because it's literally just Heath Ledger, and while I do love Heath Ledger's Joker, I didn't at the time, and I still don't need that to be the definitive image for him. I'm also just not a huge fan of his Riddler design, which he gets away from in Zero Year, thank God. But overall, Capullo's interpretation of Gotham City, and even Batman himself, and the Batcave, and the Bat family, is just enchanting. It makes the book feel like a dark fairy tale, and it's become my definitive visual interpretation of Batman personally. But as for the actual story itself, okay, if you're a casual comic book reader, or you just jumped onto the DC Comics train because you thought the New 52 was going to be a great jumping on point, which I suppose it was at the time, which I'll get to later, I can totally see how and why this comic blows your mind. Batman versus an army of undead assassins? That's a cool idea! Or, at the very least, that aspect of it. But then there's the court itself. And this is where we start to run into some slight issues. First of all, the Court of the Owls is a secret society that's made up of Gotham's elite who've been running the city for over 300 years, and they've managed to psychologically break Batman and cause him to have a mental breakdown. That is strikingly similar to a story arc that happened in Grant Morrison's run, where there was the cult called the Black Glove, and they were a secret society that was made up of Gotham's elite who managed to psychologically break Batman and cause him to have a mental breakdown.
That's redundant!
And again, I'm not trying to pit Snyder against Morrison, but it's really hard not to notice stuff like that, especially considering Batman R.I.P. came out only 3 years before Snyder's run began, and like I mentioned earlier, another issue that I have with this arc is length. this arc is very, very long. In fact, it's longer than it needs to be. And thankfully, this is the first and last time that I'll throw that complaint at the run, because the story as a whole is 13 to 14 issues, and it only really needs to be about 8. Let me break it down for you. Bruce is friends with this guy named Lincoln March. Then these assassins kill him, and they try to kill Bruce too, but Bruce digs up some information on these people, and he tries to investigate them, but then they trap him and torture him psychologically until he manages to barely escape. But then the court sends an army of undead owl assassins to Wayne Manor, and then Bruce fights them, but once he beats them all up, and then he goes to arrest the elites, he finds them all dead and realizes that Lincoln March was behind the whole thing, and he's Bruce's secret baby brother, and then they make the third act of Man of Steel happen, and then it's over. That's it. That's all that happens. I mean, he does set up Harper Row as a potential sidekick for Bruce, but her character doesn't really go anywhere. So, like I said earlier, that's it. That's all that happens. Plus, it doesn't really help that I feel like Scott Snyder is severely overanalyzing every bit of lore and character interaction that he's writing into this, and it feels like an overwritten mess sometimes. And that's maybe why the story feels so long, because he spends so much time overanalyzing every little thing. And having Batman give the reader a history lesson on the architecture of Wayne Manor or the layout of Gotham's subway system, it's a bit much. And it does feel a little self-indulgent sometimes. Not to say that I don't enjoy reading a Batman comic where Batman analyzes crime scenes and has a working knowledge on the history of the fucking universe, but part of the problem is that we're too much in Batman's head, and that results in a lot more telling than there is showing, and when you're working in a visual medium like this, that's not exactly a good thing. Also, Snyder kills off the Court of the Owls. At the very least, he severely cripples them, which I know I give them a lot of shit for being a ripoff of the Black Glove, but the core thing that makes the Court potentially more interesting than the Black Glove is the fact that they're anonymous, and they're these aristocratic elites who run the city from the shadows and hide behind masks, and they're really creepy, and you don't know how big their reach is, and how old they are, and how they seemingly dwarf Batman in comparison. And then Snyder and Capullo pull the rug from under them to make Bruce Wayne's maybe baby brother, who wears an Iron Man style owl costume, look like a badass. And I think that was a huge mistake, because Talon is nowhere near as cool as I think Snyder and Capullo wishes he was. Plus, it's not like this character really goes anywhere. And before anyone says anything, if Talon turned out to be like the overarching mastermind of Batman Eternal or something, no. Just no. I don't read tie-ins for comic book events, and I for damn sure don't read tie-ins for 50-plus issue runs, and if you think I do, bro, you want some extra shit. And look, I know I sound a bit harsh, but here's the thing. This is Scott Snyder, not some jackass like some of the other writers in the industry who keep getting gigs for whatever reason, despite proving that they're mediocre at best, if we're being generous. This is the man who wrote Batman Black Mirror. This is the man who wrote Iron Man Noir, and Superman Unchained, and the best run on Swamp Thing since Alan Moore. I know what he can do. I know that his storytelling is less clunky than this. So if I'm being hard on him, it's because I know that he can do better. And he has done better. And thankfully, as this run continues, he does in fact do better. Speaking of which, let's get to the next story arc, Death of the Family. Now, like I said before, this run is great to read in a vacuum, because the idea of what would happen if the Joker figured out that Bruce Wayne is Batman is a dynamite pitch, right? Well, okay, here's the problem. That story idea would have been amazing 5 to 10 years prior to when it was written, because again, coming off the heels of Grant Morrison's run, this story makes no sense. But that's not the fault of Snyder. If anything, DC editorial is to blame for, like, a lot. So, first and foremost, this story takes place in a loosely rebooted continuity, which means that some of the original canon still exists and some of it doesn't. However, when it comes to Batman, apparently none of it got rebooted. Everything still happened. It's just that instead of everything happening over the span of 25 years, everything happened over the course of only 5 years. So, if that's the case, that means that all of the stuff that Grant Morrison did with Batman was canon. Meaning that A, the Joker would already know that Bruce Wayne was Batman because he was recruited by Dr. Hurt in the Black Glove during Batman R.I.P. And B, this whole story and its follow-up Endgame, which I'll talk about later on in the video, are about Joker reevaluating he and Batman's relationship, which is a crucial element to Grant Morrison's run on the character, which was still technically going on at the time of this run. And even though the concept is tackled very differently, the general idea is still there. And C, now that everything in Batman's history happened over the course of only 5 years instead of, 25, that would mean that the Joker's midlife crisis from Grant Morrison's run probably happened about a week prior to this arc, and guess what?
That's redundant!
But I digress. Anyways, that bit of fanboy frustration aside, this story is really good. It's a wonderful look into the relationship between Batman and the Joker as pop culture icons, and it's a really interesting meta-commentary on how Batman is this, creature of the night who spends all of his time in this big, lonely bat cave and fashions himself as the ultimate loner, but also have an army of pet orphans in primary colored body armor at his disposal who call themselves the Bat Family, and is a core member of the Justice League. And I do like how Snyder points out that Batman has gotten so far away from what the Joker, who I guess represents DC editorial and the average Batman fan who thinks that The Dark Knight Returns and the animated series are the end-all be-all versions of the character, think Batman is, and ideally should be. And I also like how Snyder tries to push Bruce past that, and having Bruce acknowledge that he is, as a character and as a person, constantly evolving. And part of evolution is growth, and growing a family. And in some ways, Batman has kind of outgrown the Joker, and I think that idea is really fascinating. And again, in a vacuum, it reads very well, and it feels almost like a PG-13 episode of the animated series. All that said, I do have one minor gripe with the way that this book is collected, and it's the censorship of the Joker's homoerotic euphemisms. Because the Joker is written to be very similar to that of Frank Miller's Joker from Dark Knight Returns, which is my personal favorite Joker, and is why I fell in love with Snyder's version in the first place. But when the story was collected in trade, DC editorial edited a lot of the Joker's dialogue, which I felt cheapened Batman's final line to the Joker a little bit. But all that aside, the story itself is really fun, and again, Snyder uses his horror background to great effect here, especially with all the stuff relating to the Joker and his version of that character. He and Greg Capullo reimagine him as this horrific, larger-than-life nightmare man, and he's the Dark Mirror to Batman in the sense that he will do things that don't quite seem possible, making him feel like he's more than human. Kinda like how the criminals of Gotham view Batman as a larger-than-life creature of the night. But the brilliance behind that is that we as the audience know how Bruce does the things that he does, giving the illusion of him being a force of nature, while the Joker does the same thing. But we, the reader, aren't clued into how he makes everything happen, and then that puts us in the same shoes as the criminals of Gotham, and I think that's really fascinating, and that's a really fun idea. Plus, I love the visualization of the Joker here, where he's wearing his dismembered face like a mask. Not only does Greg Capullo make it look about as horrifying as anyone possibly could make it look, but I feel like it's symbolic of the Joker's overall message. It's unappealing, and it's not how that character is traditionally and ideally portrayed, but that's how the Joker views Batman in this arc. And, that's all part of his show. That's part of the joke. And the ending is amazing, because after the entire Bat family endures absolute hell from the Joker because of a secret that Bruce kept from them regarding the possibility of the Joker knowing their secret identities, even though he clearly knew in Grant Morrison's run, which is still technically canon, but whatever. They don't trust Bruce anymore. That secret broke his family and turned everyone away. Everyone except Dick, who was more than ready to jump back into the fray with Bruce, but Bruce is so demoralized, he just assumes that Dick would turn his back on him too, and it's so sad. But it's such a beautiful ending to a great story. And then we have 0 Year. Now, as I understand it, 0 Year is quite controversial because a lot of people, and by a lot of people I mean most people, and by most people I mean damn near everybody, holds Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli's Batman Year One in high regard. So much so that many Batman purists will recognize it as the only Batman origin that matters. And you know what? That's fine. I completely understand that train of thought. That said, Batman 0 Year is hands down the best Batman origin for an in-continuity DC Universe Batman, no ifs, ands, or buts. So, first of all, 0 Year is the greatest Riddler story ever told, which, to be fair, the bar wasn't really all that high in the first place, and I get it. Writing the Riddler is hard. It's the reason why he doesn't show up that often in Batman the Animated Series. The writers admitted that writing the Riddler was bullshit because coming up with new riddles that were just the right level of impossible freaking sucked. But as someone who really likes the Riddler as a concept and loves seeing him portrayed not as a joke, this was really satisfying and it legitimized my claims that the Riddler is just as big of a threat as the Joker. Second, this is where I feel like Scott Snyder finds his footing on the book. Because after this, everything that I don't like about how he overanalyzes what's on the page and tends to fight Greg Capullo for attention by telling the story through text rather than letting Greg help tell his story through visual storytelling is gone. And this is where I start to board the Snyder Capullo hype train. Plus, as much as I really enjoy Year One and admire the iconography of it and its impact on the legacy of Batman, it feels too grounded. Like, post Year One, I can't see that version of Batman beating up ninjas in the desert and fighting Ra's al Ghul in the heart of a volcano, or in 5 years' time, that version of Batman bumping elbows with Superman and Wonder Woman and the Flash, fighting Brainiac at the edge of the universe, or Darkseid on the outskirts of the multiverse. For fuck's sake, in Year One, after Bruce gets stabbed in the leg by a prepubescent hooker and shot by a cop who was most likely a transfer from the LAPD, the dude is out. Like, he's so squishy and fragile and human. Meanwhile, you have the Batman that's presented in 0 Year, and I can totally buy that this Batman becomes that Batman. And again, Year One is an excellent story, but for an in-continuity origin story for the legendary Dark Knight, 0 Year just works way better. And now that I've said my piece, let's actually talk about the story of 0 Year. So, this arc is broken up into 3 parts: Secret City, Dark City, and Savage City. And I absolutely love what these guys do with the Batman origin, because they basically do what Grant Morrison and Rags Morales did with Superman over in the New 52 Action Comics series, where they weave all of the different Batman comic book origins from the Golden Age and the Silver Age and the Modern Age together, and they give us this meta-narrative, definitive Batman origin story that I think works very well, even down to the costume being very Golden Age inspired, which I personally really love from Greg Capullo, by the way. And while the story overall is very long, I don't feel the same way about this as I do Court of the Owls, because this is 13 issues, and I think, unlike Court of the Owls, 0 Year needs all 13 issues to tell its story. And it starts out with Secret City, which is the first arc of 0 Year, and it's basically the Bruce Wayne segments on the first issue of Year One stretched out to 4 issues. We also get a really good look at what corruption looks like in this more heightened DC Universe style Gotham City, and how all of the city's elite 1% are being blackmailed into joining this criminal organization known as the Red Hood Gang, which I think is a really fun and interesting way to update the Red Hood. I also like that Alfred is apprehensive about Bruce doing whatever the hell it is that he's trying to do while figuring out how he's going to clean up Gotham. And I know that I'm in the minority, but I actually really like the tension there. Because here's the thing. Alfred isn't like Jarvis in the sense that Jarvis is just Tony Stark's butler and that's it. That's their relationship. Nothing more, nothing less. Alfred is Bruce Wayne's dad. So I've never really had a problem with him voicing concern or protest over Bruce being Batman. And I also like how, on the flip side of this, Bruce is kind of an asshole. Like, his intentions are noble, but he's very abrasive and suffers from some real tunnel vision to the point of missing very obvious clues such as who he should trust and who he should keep at arm's length. And it isn't until Bruce finally gets his shit together and becomes Batman that he starts seeing things more clearly. I also love how over-the-top Snyder and Capullo's Batman is. In fact, at the very end of Secret City, Bruce even has a line where he says something like, "Batman doesn't do subtle," and that's just my preferred take on the character. Theatricality and deception, powerful agents that I think are inherent to the Batman mythology. But I digress. Then we get Act 2, which is Dark City, and that's more or less the rise of the Riddler. And I love their Riddler. Like I said, they treat the character with a lot of respect, and he's genuinely scary. And Snyder and Capullo make a case for Batman's rogues, each being terrifying in their own right. And in that, I feel like they elevate Batman as sort of a mythic, larger-than-life legend that Gotham looks up to, because a hero is only as good as their villain. And speaking of which, they also bring back Dr. Death from the Golden Age, and they make him a bone creature man? And that's really cool, because it not only feels more Golden Age in the sense that one of Batman's first villains from the 30s is roped back into continuity, but is also a monster person, which is also really fun, and a clever homage to Batman's Golden Age roots, because Batman used to fight monsters and demons and shit, and people tend to forget about that. But yeah, after the Riddler holds Gotham hostage, Batman fails. And this is the bookend to Act 2, because Gotham gets flooded, and the city is under Riddler's thumb. And that's when we get Act 3, Savage City. And this is when the book goes off the rails in the best way possible, because, especially after reading some of their other projects, I get the feeling that Snyder and Capullo are huge fans of Mad Max and Escape from New York and stuff like that, and that's kind of what Savage City is. And the whole story is basically Batman coming back from the dead after he disappears, and he does what nobody else could do. He takes the city back from the Riddler, not just with brute force, but with a cunning intellect. Because he's Batman. And I know that some people take issue with that notion and think that it makes him a Mary Sue, Gary Stu type character. And while I tend to agree, I think that it works within the context of the story. Because this comic, and really Snyder's entire run on the character up to this point, is about Batman as a legend and as an icon and his relationship with the city. Which I also think is really interesting how Snyder and Capullo depict that somewhat literally, because after Batman beats up the Riddler, well, of course with the Riddler being the Riddler, he had a failsafe just in case he was defeated. And he's wearing this heart monitor that's rigged to the city, and after Bruce takes it off of him and he places it onto his own chest, he electrocutes himself and reboots the city's power grid to match his own heartbeat. So Gotham is now powered by Batman's heart. And, that's kind of cheesy, but for the material, it works perfectly. Plus, with the story technically being a prequel, we start to see how Bruce winds up becoming, arrogant and full of himself like he is in Court of the Owls. And we also see how Bruce starts to trade having a life for being Batman. And while that's treated with some level of reverence at the end of the story here, it's interesting how that's depicted in earlier Snyder Capullo stories, and even subsequent stories by them, as being a massive character flaw. And finally, I wanted to talk to you guys about Endgame. Now, Endgame is kind of a weird one for me, because in a lot of ways, I have the same problems with this arc that I have with Death of the Family, in the sense that it only works within the vacuum, specifically this run. However, at the same time, given what this run is and how continuity is just kind of a relic of a bygone era as the medium of comics progresses, just as a story, this was wonderful. And I honestly feel like if this were to be the last Batman Joker story, I'd be okay with that. Because this book's whole thesis is that the Joker is a scorned lover. You know, after the events of Death of the Family, Joker is heartbroken that Batman chooses his family and friends over being his playmate. And again, it works very well as a celebration of the Batman and Joker's 80-year relationship, and the culmination of all this built-up pseudo-sexual tension. And on top of that, this is a horror story, and Scott Snyder excels at horror. And not only that, but that tone works when you're writing a story about the Joker taking off his kid gloves and burning everything to the ground. You know, he infects the city with this really potent Joker venom that turns the entire city into Joker zombies, and Greg Capullo has a lot of fun with that concept and gives us a gallery of terrifying and haunting imagery that makes me more disturbed than seeing R. Kelly at a middle school graduation. Hell, there's a scene at some point where the Joker is crawling out from underneath Commissioner Gordon's bed like the boogeyman, and soon after that, Gordon pops him like 3 times. And after he thinks that he finally, after all these years, avenged his daughter for the events of Killing Joke and his dead wife Sarah, assuming that No Man's Land still happened, or, you know, if Sarah even existed in the New 52, after Jim starts shedding the manliest tears of pure ecstasy, the Joker stands up in the background like a fucking slasher movie monster and hacks Gordon in the chest with an axe. And there's a lot of really cool stuff like that with the Joker in this arc. But most importantly, I think the big thing that works really well in this, you know, besides Greg Capullo's art, is that the Joker turns the tables on Batman mainly because his perception of their relationship has inverted. Because to the Joker, this was all a big performance, and Gotham was their stage. But once Batman refused to play along in their last encounter, he stopped looking at their narrative as a comedy and instead started looking at it as a tragedy. You know, that's why he turns the city against Batman and makes himself the hero of Gotham City by infecting everyone with a zombie-like Joker venom. There's also the question of whether or not he's immortal. Like, not metaphysically. Physically and literally immortal. But what we find out is that for all this time, he's had access to a discount Lazarus pit somewhere under Gotham, and that's actually where Batman and Joker have their final battle. And it's beautifully choreographed, and I know that there's some debate regarding how brutal it gets, but I kind of like it. Because it illustrates a finality to the battle. You know, like, this is it. This is Batman and the Joker's last dance. And to that point about immortality, I do think that it's interesting, you know, this notion of in-universe symbolism, and what Batman represents as an absolute concept, and how he's kind of worshipped as a god, and that idea really hits home after coming off the heels of Zero Year, where those ideas are kind of the point of the story, and how Bruce ultimately comes to terms with the concept of death and his own mortality, because at this point in the run, he's finally accepted that he's not a god. You know, even though he fights by their side, and even fights them on occasion, and wins, which is actually how this arc opens, interestingly enough, he himself is not a god. Even though Batman is worshipped as one, Bruce is a flesh and blood, very mortal man. And that's the opposite of how he viewed himself at the beginning of this run. And there's a really clear character arc that he has in these 40 issues. One that juxtaposes the Joker's, where he does see himself as an absolute concept and does have a desire to be immortal, and when he's faced with his own mortality, he just can't stand it, and I think that's really interesting. And the story is written with tons of reverence for the history and legacy of these characters. Some would say a tad overwritten, but honestly, it's nothing objectively bad at this point, because post-Zero Year, when I say that Snyder is overwritten, I mean that in the way that I mean that Chris Claremont, or Stan Lee, or Brian Michael Bendis pre-Siege can be overwritten. Like, I don't dislike what he's writing, but I'm more of a trust the artist to do their job and don't clutter their work with a lot of words kind of guy. Especially when you're working with someone like Greg Capullo. But even then, by this point, Snyder is easing up on that, and I think he gets considerably better in future installments. However, if I did have one major complaint to lob against it, it would be that this is clearly a follow-up from Death of the Family, and it seems like everyone kissed and made up between the panels, making Death of the Family feel inconsequential. And I swear on everything, if you tell me that Batman Eternal deals with those ideas, I'm gonna be really mad. And part of that is at the fault of Zero Year being as long as it is. And as much as I do love that story, it's hard to argue that it doesn't take up some valuable page space that could have been used to explore Batman and his fractured relationship with the Bat family after the events of Death of the Family. But, you know, it'd be like that. But yeah, this is where I'm going to end part 1. I feel like this is a good stopping point for the video, mainly because this is technically where the New 52 ends. And in part 2, I'm going to get into all of the DCU material, you know, Super Heavy and All-Star Batman, and I'm also going to talk about Last Night on Earth. But yeah, overall, this New 52 run, for me, was pretty hit or miss, but when it hit like an abusive father on Veterans Day. But when it missed, yikes. But thankfully, there were far more hits than there were misses, and like I said earlier, some of that's on Snyder, some of that's on DC editorial, and some of that's on me for being a fanboy who just can't let go of his own bullshit preconceived notions. But again, I understand why so many people were enchanted with this run, especially when it first started, and I don't know, I always felt like I came off like a Snyder Capullo hater, and I'm not. You know, I genuinely like this run and appreciate it for what it is. And even though I keep comparing this to Morrison's run, as much as I love Morrison, for what it's worth, I don't think that run is perfect either. You know, and even though I didn't bring up Tom King's Batman run all that much in this, I know that I speak very highly of it, but again, not perfect. Actually, I'd say it's far from perfect. But in regards to Morrison in particular, I guess I gravitate towards his run a little more than this because that's what I read first. And really, that's it. You know, it's just a matter of what you were exposed to first. Plus, Scott Snyder has gone on podcasts and done interviews where he says that he's basically had this run in the back of his head for years. So, contrary to some jabs that I took at him earlier, in actuality, I don't see he and Capullo's run as a ripoff of Morrison's. If anything, I think it's just another case of great minds think alike. It only so happens that his material was released after Morrison's. That said, I do enjoy a lot of stuff about the Snyder Capullo run, and I respect the iconography that it's earned in recent years. But those are my thoughts, but what about you? What do you think of the Snyder Capullo Batman run? Specifically everything between Court of the Owls and Endgame, which is more or less the main Batman story. Let me know down below in the comment section. Also, if you like this video, hit the like button, share, support the channel, and if you want to see more content like this, all you have to do is subscribe. I'm the Mystical Green Beanie, thanks for watching, and as always, until next time, adios nachos, adios.